What do Abraham Lincoln, Emily Dickinson, Ken Griffey Jr., and Sheryl Crow all have in common? Well, they reportedly all have suffered from depression because illness doesn't care how smart you are, how gifted you are, how famous you are, or how wealthy you are. Find out more about the illness of depression and the latest and most effective treatments tonight as we begin Season 5 on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. We begin a new season with a discussion about one of the most common mental health issues worldwide today, depression. It is for us a great place to start because this program is all about discussions that raise awareness, decrease stigma, and instill hope for people with mental illness and for their families and friends. If you've been with us in past seasons, you know that we depend on your questions to help explore this issue. So call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. And you can also email them using the address listed at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show, so get busy. Join me for our season premiere are Dr. David Baldus, a psychiatrist with St. Luke's Mental Health Service who sees adult clients, and Joanne Fairfield, a psychotherapist with the Human Development Center who treats adults with depression and other mental illnesses. Thanks to both of you for joining me this evening on our opening 5th season. I can't believe we've been here for 5 years, and I'm so glad to have both of you on to welcome this new season.
Thank you.
And I think a great place to start would be to talk about the symptoms of the illness of depression, because it's not just a matter of feeling sad for a few days.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, that's an important distinction to make. Depression certainly needs to be distinguished from everyday sadness. People with depression have certainly do have sadness, but they also have physical changes and changes in their thinking, and typically have very significant functional impairment that goes far beyond a typical bad day or two.
And so some of those symptoms of depression include things like feeling hopeless and that excessive guilt. Talk a little bit also just about kind of, Joanne, the biology of the depression with the symptoms of the sleep and the appetite for us.
Certainly. I mean, usually certain people will notice a change in their sleep pattern. Often people will either struggle with insomnia, or some people will actually go the other way and find that because of the fatigue, they're trying to sleep all the time. They don't feel like getting out of bed. It feels like a heavy leaden weight. Literally, I've had people describe it as like a weight resting on them that they just can't shift. So along with that also comes frequently a loss of appetite. I mean, people talk about comfort eating, but I don't see that so much with depression. I see more people losing interest in pretty much everything, and that includes one of, as far as I'm concerned, great joys of living, which is eating. Mm-hmm.
And people talk about forgetting to eat, even.
Yes.
That they can get to 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and they will have forgotten how to eat.
Yeah, and I think it's tough when you're a parent of a child who's depressed, because sometimes you don't see so much a depressed mood, but you'll see increased irritability and crankiness. They'll fly off the handle more easily frequently. And it's very hard, not just for the parent, but also for the professional, sometimes to tell the difference between what's the adolescent behavior that you might expect and what is actually moving you towards maybe a more clinical picture of depression.
Some of my clients have talked about one of the good ways of maybe helping parents understand that difference between normal teenage irritability and when that's crossed into depression is when the teenager says about themselves, "I'm so crabby, even I can't stand me."
Yes. That's really nice if they come and say that.
Right? It's not just I can't just stand my parents. I can't even stand
stand
myself.
to be with myself. Yeah.
And certainly we know that for many people with depression, suicidal thinking is a part of their depression as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, in terms of the numbers, about 3 or 4% of people with major depression go on to complete suicide, and a more significant number of patients will think about suicide or make attempts on their life. And it seems to represent a solution to a problem that seems unsolvable for them. That is a feeling that is intolerable and can't seem to go away. And it's a tragic outcome for what really can be a treatable illness.
And talk a little bit about that, Joanne, that connection between that hopelessness that so often is a part of really significant depression that people have, and that tie in to suicidal thinking or morbid thinking, wishing that they were dead.
Well, I think it's because the horizon becomes very, very short in one sense, in that they can't see past the immediacy because everything has slowed down so much. And then on the other hand, I think the other horizon of hope is so far away it doesn't exist. It's when people get to that place, and often people that I've worked with anyway have thought about suicide frequently for far longer than the number of times they've attempted. But when they make the attempt, it can feel impulsive, but it's had a lot of long, slow burn beforehand.
You were nodding your head as Joanne was talking. What's your own experience with your own patients been with that?
Yeah, well, I would say that the suicidal thinking is quite common, and although the final act may be an impulsive act, it's the culmination of a long time coming. I think part of the difficulty with depression is that hopelessness is in fact a symptom, and what we know about people with depression is that their ability to see things as they truly are, to see hope that may exist, is heavily skewed and is impaired. And so it actually affects that rational thought process that says, well, help can work. I know someone else that was helped. A person with a severe depression truly can't believe that that's possible for them.
You know, it's almost as if instead of having on rose-colored glasses, they have like black-colored glasses, where everything is really filtered through a place of blackness, and that this distortion in thinking that exists is a symptom of the illness, not just a matter of being pessimistic, but a real symptom of the illness, because you take that away and they'll see things differently.
Literally, almost. I mean, I've had people talk about that the world becomes colorless. I had somebody talk about how they had crabapple trees in their backyard, which they usually loved, and they completely missed them blossoming. They didn't notice them. It's a very gray world. Very, very gray world, and I've had people literally describe it in those terms.
The selective attention for everything that happens that's bad in your life, that happens that's bad in the day, things that you don't like is what you notice, things that irritate you is what you notice, which is so different from our normal course of when we're feeling okay, and we can notice things that matter to us. We can notice when the lake is beautiful. We can notice a beautiful day like today that we are having. Here's a caller, Dr. Baldus, a woman from Duluth calls in and says, what is the difference between depression following a loss and depression that needs to be addressed clinically? And by loss, she was referring to a grief when somebody dies.
That is a hotly debated topic in psychiatry and has been for a long time. We would describe the sadness following a loss as bereavement, and that's a normal process. It's not a pathological process, and it's a necessary process in order to move forward and to heal and to grow following a loss. Now, historically, even there was an exclusion for the diagnosis of major depression if a person was grieving for a certain time frame. Now, that's been removed in the most recent version of our diagnostic manual. But warning signs in the context of grief would be certainly suicidal thinking, symptoms that cause...
so I think that's really, I'm going to interrupt you here for a second just to say that's really important to know and to understand that suicidal thinking is not a part of the normal grief, even very tragic grief that is so painful where you don't know how you're going to make it through the day. That's very, very different from having thoughts that you want to kill yourself.
Right. And then I think the second criterion would be the degree of functional impairment, that it's, I think, normal and healthy to have a period of time after a loss where you have a decreased responsibility and a sense of perhaps diminished capacity to face life. But if that persists for months or starts to look more like a major depression where a person might not be able to get out of bed, might not be able to take care of their own basic physical needs, then I think you've crossed over from normal grief into pathological depression.
What have you noticed in the clients that you've seen, the difference between that bereavement versus clinical depression?
Well, I think Dr. Walters has described it really well. I think one of the best descriptions I've seen in the literature, literally, just was by Joan Didion, and she wrote A Year of Magical Thinking. And it was one of the best descriptions I've ever seen, bar none, not only of what it feels like subjectively to be grieving, but because of her background, she also did a really stunning job of doing the research about how literally our brain doesn't function in the same way, and describing it well in layman's terms. So I think there's also an issue of sometimes people think they're supposed to get over it in a certain specific period of time, and everybody grieves a little differently. Every culture has its own pattern and habit. Cultures with a capital C as well as a small c, different families do it differently, and different individuals do it differently. So I think paying attention to the differences that Dr. Baldus outlined is a good cue to know when you need to start looking for help, but not necessarily that if you don't have the suicidal thinking, etc., you don't need to rush yourself through your own grief.
I think that's really important, where we're focusing now more on just how is the grieving disrupting your life, not on, geez, it's been 4 months, okay, we're not going to say that you have clinical depression that needs to be treated, even if you're completely incapacitated. We're not going to help you. We're going to tell you come back in 2 months, and that we're moving away from that and saying, how much are you suffering? Because how much you're suffering tells us more about how we can help you then. A woman calls in from Two Harbors asking, Dr. Baldus, do you think depression can lead to chemical abuse?
Absolutely, unequivocally. Depression is very commonly what we would say comorbid, or runs along with substance abuse, and those problems tend to feed into one another. And so it's a very common part of my practice to work with patients who are dealing with substance abuse or addiction problem and depression, and we could spend much of our time trying to figure out which came first, whether the depression led to substance use by means of self-medication, or whether substance use and the effects on the brain and the consequences thereof led to depression, but they very commonly go together. And the most important thing is that both are treatable and both need to be treated in order to get over those things. That is to say that if you neglect the substance use problem and try to treat the depression, things are not as likely to go well, and if you neglect the depression and try to treat the substance use problem, that's also not likely to go well.
And it's really interesting that a lot of the substances that people choose to use, alcohol, marijuana, things that typically often might depress mood or bring you down a little bit, are using often in a form of self-medication. Ironically, even though what we know is that, oh, you've just dug the hole a little deeper here for yourself. What has your experience been, Joanne, with people using substances and then being able to talk with them about, geez, in order to feel a little bit better with your depression, we're going to need to have you consider an alternative form of treatment than your alcohol, for example?
Well, I have all kinds of responses to that question, depending on who I'm talking to and what stage they are actually in their illness. Sometimes you'll get a fair amount of resistance. And I try to ask people to think about, if they can, the time when they were not using whatever the substances they're using, and what was their quality of life, how they saw it anyway, at that time, and what, if any, are the differences, and what their fears are if they should give it up. Because often people are afraid to give up the one tool, as they see it, for making themselves be able to cope with how they feel without having something to put in its place. And then we spend a lot of time talking about, so what are alternatives, and what ones are realistic ones for that individual? Because not everything works for everybody.
I think that's huge, though, too, that if, you know, what you mentioned about, wow, this is the one thing that I feel has been helping me, and I'm miserable enough as it is, and now you're going to ask me to give that up. You're asking an awful lot of somebody who already, let's keep in mind, is feeling hopeless, and now we're going to say, well, geez, you're going to have to feel a little worse before you get better. It's like, wow, I didn't think I could feel worse, and now you want me to feel even worse before I can get better. We ask a lot of people with depression. I think one of the things that's astounding to me is that we know treatment is effective, and simultaneously we ask a lot of people with depression just to come into treatment because here you are feeling hopeless. And so let's talk a little bit about what we would say, especially to people in the viewing audience right now who are feeling hopeless, about why should you come in for treatment?
What a wonderful question, Carolyn. My thought is that things can be better, and but yes, it does take a great deal of work. And I think it's important as clinicians that we acknowledge that, but also that work that we ask patients to do, I think in the best case scenario gives them a sense of empowerment and control and ownership over their recovery, rather than being a passive person receiving treatment, having treatment done to them, medications administered to them, having therapy done to them. As Joanne will tell you, therapy is a tremendous amount of work. And so I think there's tremendous benefit there when recovery does come, that a patient can take great ownership over that. And I think that's what I try to remind people.
You were nodding your head as Dr. Baldus was talking.
Yeah, because there is, I mean, if I'd answered that question, my first thought in my head was, well, because we know it works. I mean, there's a lot of mental illness that is tough to treat. The good thing about depression is we've done a lot of homework about it, and we know what can help. The hardest part, I think, for people is actually owning that they need help. I remember being told by one of my first bosses donkeys years ago, and he said, you know, a good 70% at least of the work that a client needs to do is done before they come in the office, before they pick up that phone. Because picking up that phone and asking to see somebody is probably the hardest thing that they will do. Acknowledging that you need some help and being okay to go for it is huge. And then it becomes a step-by-step process. A step-by-step process. Combination of whether it's medication, talk therapy, exercise is well established as being tremendously effective. And I don't mean that you have to go and spend 3 hours in the gym pumping iron, but that thing we talked about at the beginning, where people just feel so leaden and weighted down and tired.
My clients often describe it as, I feel like I'm super glued to my bed, and that is the sensation that I have, and so that's why when you ask me what happens that I don't get out of bed, it's that I can't get my mind beyond that feeling of being super glued. And yet we know what you were saying is that exercise can play a huge part in recovery from depression.
So in my role as a DBT therapist, which is one of my other functions, one of the things we teach all the time is mindfulness. It's right at the center of it. And I know it's the recipe of the year and everybody talks about mindfulness, but it's also been around for thousands of years. We're just starting to pay attention to it, I think, in our field. And one of the things, that small stepping stone is when somebody says, I can't get out of bed, is to acknowledge to themselves that they actually managed to get out of bed and get in the shower. That's huge. And that they need to give themselves credit for doing that. And then that they acknowledge that they brushed their teeth and they combed their hair. Step, step, step.
And I work a lot giving people homework assignments, and I always talk with them about the only thing that you need to do to get better is to do your homework today. And if you do your homework today, and if you do it tomorrow, and if you do it the next day, and if you don't do it on Tuesday, but you pick up again on Wednesday, eventually you will be able to see and feel better, and you'll be able to see better. But that's all you have to focus on is what are we doing today?
Yeah.
I think that's a very difficult part of treating depression in trying to change behavior, which we know is tremendously effective, is if you wait until you feel like it, it will never happen. It will never happen. And so I must comment on exercise because it is so important as a treatment for depression. It has great neurobiological evidence to suggest that it is effective, that it's similarly effective as antidepressant medicines or as electroconvulsive therapy for the right patient. The similar kind of brain changes happen with regular exercises happen with those treatments. And what I encourage patients to do, if possible, is to think about this small exercise task, which might just be a walk around the block at the beginning, as that's their medicine for the day. It's not that they're going to exercise when they feel like exercising or when they want to, but this is something that they have to do to take care of themselves. And maybe it's going to take several weeks before they feel like doing it. But depression is an illness of patterns. And unhealthy patterns develop. And as Joanne said, step by step, we need to build healthier patterns, starting at really the ground level.
What is it now? This is amazing because here you are. You're a physician, you're a psychiatrist, and you come on the show and you want to talk about the benefits of exercise.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And not just talk about medicine and what medicine can do, but we also know that medicine plays a role in the treatment, especially of severe depression. When do you see as medication being most helpful for people?
I would say with moderate to severe depression, certainly depression that leads to a hospitalization, depression associated with suicidal thinking. Medication is typically a necessary part of a treatment plan. I would say that although a great number of people have spent a tremendous amount of time, effort, energy, and money on developing medication treatments for depression, what we know is that in a vacuum, they are reasonably effective, but not as effective as many other treatments for other medical conditions. And so it's really critically important for patients to understand that medication treatment is not something that will solve a depressive episode, but can be a necessary part of a whole treatment plan, including talk therapy and behavior change, diet modification, these kind of things.
We're getting short on time, but I want to have just at least a little moment of how family members can help the depressed, their depressed loved one.
Well, the first one thing is, I suppose, to acknowledge it, and also acknowledge the effect it has on them, because I think there's sometimes it feels like a mirroring in families. You have a depressed spouse, you start to feel a little depressed or frustrated and more irritable yourself because, quote unquote, nothing seems to work and they're not listening and they're withdrawn and. So to be able to acknowledge that this is an illness, that they're not choosing to ignore you and withdraw from you, that is part of their illness. And then to be as supportive as you can be without wrapping them up in cotton wool, in getting help. So it's kind of like when you're a parent and you're teaching somebody something. You walk alongside your child. You don't do the walking for them.
I like that. Don't treat them as if they're fragile. And I think we have to wrap up because I'm getting a frantic look of we're down to 1 minute here. So thank you so much for joining me this evening, and thanks to you for joining our discussion on our first show of the season. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, the place where I answer more of your questions. A wonderful discussion about depression. I think the take-home message needs to be for you that there is hope and there's good treatment available. You do not need to suffer and simply be miserable. You can also email us your questions about next week's show, when we'll be talking with a very special guest about what psychotherapy is really like and how you can get the most out of it. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.